Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, Summer Session 2019. In this video, we're going over, for the most part, Immanuel Kant. And we'll be comparing him to David Hume and Plato. So the reading is from a Critique of Pure Reason, and we'll be going over the questions for exam 3. And that first one we'll be going over today is part A, question 3, which is, in what ways are Kant's theory of a self similar to and different than Hume's theory of a self in chapter 10 of our book? So in chapter 10 of our book, we read an excerpt from a treatise of human nature in which Hume argues that there is no such thing as a self. As an empiricist, Hume is arguing that all that we ever actually experience are sense perceptions from our 5 sense organs: sights and sounds and touches and tastes and smells. And if I left one out, the 5 sense organs. So I see a bunch of different sights, I hear a bunch of different sounds, they're fleeting there's a tremendous, inconceivable rapidity of this flux of sense perceptions, but nowhere in any of them do any one of my 5 sense organs detect a self. If you define a self as something that remains identical to itself from one moment to the next, it's just an ever-changing flux. That's all we ever actually experience. So if knowledge comes through the senses, then there is no self. So for Immanuel Kant, he is bridging the gap between the empiricists like David Hume and John Locke and the rationalists like René Descartes and Leibniz and the ultimate rationalist, Plato, the original father of the idea of the eternal absolute forms of reason, the absolute ideas, like the idea of justice, the idea of beauty, and the ultimate idea of the good, but also the idea of tree, the idea of rabbit. Those are the 2 I use a lot. Any trees that you see in the material world, says Plato, are emanations from the absolute idea of tree, which exists according to the Phaedrus, the dialogue called the Phaedrus, at the outermost heaven of heavens. So we've been over that a bunch of times, and we'll go over it some more as we're discussing these potential exam questions. So for Kant, he's saying Hume and Plato are both right. And I will explain why, but I might as well read part B, question number 6. What is the difference between Kant's rationalism and Plato's rationalism? And also number 5 for part B, exam 3, why does Kant compare himself to Copernicus? So those are the 3 questions we'll be going over in this video, and they all relate with each other. So the difference between Kant's rationalism and Plato's rationalism, which will also help us understand the difference and similarities between Hume's theory of a self and Kant's theory, is that Plato says these forms of reason are eternal, and they are the sources of the material things that we encounter. So if you encounter a tree, it's because that tree is participating in the idea of tree, the absolute perfect essence of what it is to be a tree. And that sounds very strange, but again, I think in the 21st century, it sounds a little less strange when we compare it to the extremely strange evolution of physics, from special relativity to general relativity to quantum mechanics to string theory, which says the past, the present, and the future of our 3-dimensional world radiate in from the outermost horizon of the cosmos. So I've been over that before. I just mention it again and again because it makes Plato's claim and the claim in the Upanishads about the ether more plausible. It's just not something to be dismissed as a holdover from primitive thinking people. It's just very strange that we should be coming back around to that basic worldview. So Kant is saying, yes, there are absolute forms of knowledge that can give us certain a priori, meaning before experience, before any sense perceptions, we can know for certain how what are called material objects will interact with each other, how they will relate with each other. But it's not because those forms of reason are the source of those material objects, but it's because the material objects that we perceive are just the appearances in our minds. So this is the most complicated reading for this whole condensed 6-week class. And so I'm going to be going over it first in a rough way, enough to just give you a basic idea to approach the exam, and then I'll give a little more detail. So for Kant, what he's saying is, whatever the thing is in itself, you're observing this material world. Here's the famous mouse I use in these videos. What is this mouse in itself? Kant will say, that's unknowable. It's impossible to know. All I can know is how it appears to my mind. But the way it appears to my mind follows very definite laws, rules, that you can be certain of. They will be necessarily true everywhere in the universe, contrary to what Hume said. Hume was right, however, Kant said, inasmuch as we cannot know what things are in themselves. So Hume was a skeptic. He's saying we can't know anything for certain. We learn everything through sense perceptions, and anything you can learn through sense perceptions by observing the material world is always contingent. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It just is that way. There's no laws of reason that demand things unfold the same way all the time. The so-called laws of physics that Newton discovered, says David Hume, aren't necessarily going to be true everywhere in the universe for all time in the future. They might not have been always true in the past. They're very valuable, but they are not necessarily universally true. Kant is saying, yes, they are, but not for the reason most people think. Newton's laws of physics are true, says Kant, because they are telling us the way any human observer will necessarily perceive the unknowable thing in itself anywhere in the universe. So what is this mouse before I perceive it? It's impossible for me to tell, because whenever I perceive it, it's already been filtered through the categories of my thought. Those are the absolute ideas that Plato talked about. And the difference is, Plato says, oh yeah, the idea of a perfect mouse in God's mind, and so you got to think about all kinds of crazy scenarios like, okay, is there an idea for everything? But at any rate, Plato would say, the source of this mouse is the idea of mouse. All of the absolute ideas are imprinted on my soul. I can know this thing because, in one sense, I am this thing because I'm one with the idea of which this thing is made, from which this thing is projected. Kant is saying, we can't say that. That's beyond the ability for a human to know. But we can know how the world as it appears to humans will always behave. So I'm hoping it's going to start to sound a little more clear. I mean, I just want to give you here is a little example of the way I've been reading this. So it's a relatively new book, so I've got to reread everything. But here's just, you got to circle things and link his ideas over here and there, and he's using words in novel ways, and it's just extremely difficult. While reading through this again and again and again, I'm thinking to myself, okay, these students in an introductory class aren't going to have time to really digest this. If you've read it through and were patient enough to read every word, and that's impressive enough, I'm assuming it was extremely difficult to absorb much of this. And so again, like I said, I'm going over the answers quickly, and then I'll go back with a little more detail and just give you a taste, an introductory taste of one of the most complicated writers, Immanuel Kant, but also I think one of the most important, so it's worthwhile to get into some of the details of these paragraphs, each one of which is linked to all the others in ways that clarify the ones that come before and after, so it's extremely complicated, like I said. But let me just, to give some order to what we're trying to do here, let me read again the questions we are going over. So, question B, number 5, why does Kant compare himself to Copernicus? Part B, number 6, what is the difference between Kant's rationalism, Plato's rationalism, And then part A, number 3, in what ways are Kant's theory of a self similar to and different than Hume's theory of a self in chapter 10 of our book? Okay, so I think the easiest way, well, I haven't even touched on the Copernicus aspect yet, so I'll briefly mention that. So Copernicus, he thought, okay, everyone's trying to figure out how to predict the motions of the planets, the problem of the planets. Plato brought this up in the Republic. Sometimes, if you look up at the night sky, the outermost sphere of the stars would appear to be all in, because they're so far away, they appear all to be on one surface, and they appear to be moving regularly all the time. They don't change direction, but some of them, the stars, appear to be wandering stars. That's what the word planets comes from. It means sometimes they're moving with the rest, sometimes they stop, sometimes they're going. How do you account for this seemingly chaotic motion of some of the stars in relation to most of them, which are fixed together in a pattern, and they move always in the same direction? So Copernicus said, well, maybe instead of thinking that all of these wandering stars revolve around the Earth, we should think that the Earth revolves around the sun. So he changed it from a geocentric, Earth-centered view of the universe to a heliocentric, sun-centered idea of the solar system. But even then, the sun wasn't considered the center of the universe. The whole idea of other stars being suns with other solar systems, so there was no known center of the universe, and the humans were cast out of their privileged position as the central point of the whole universe. And an important aside to that is, according to general relativity, which is Isaac Newton's improvement upon, it's Einstein's improvement upon Isaac Newton's theory of gravity. So according to general relativity, the current theory of gravity, no matter where you are in the universe, it appears from your perspective that you're in the center of an expanding universe. So the Earth is in the center of the universe, so is the sun. If you're on the sun, it appears that the sun's in the center of the universe. If you're on the Earth, it appears the Earth's the center of the universe. And all the other galaxies are expanding away from your central point at an exponential rate, no matter where you are. So if you're on a galaxy from our perspective that appears to be expanding away, then you'll appear on that galaxy to be a stationary central point. Everyone else is expanding away from you. So that's an important, I think, aside. But in Kant's time, Einstein hadn't corrected Newton's oversights yet. So the whole idea is, don't see the Earth as the center. See the Earth as rotating around the sun. Similarly, when we're trying to observe material nature, don't think that we are observing what the thing is in itself, but try to see that the things out that we're observing are just appearances that are following our laws of understanding. So I didn't say that very well, so you know what, let me just let Immanuel Kant say it for himself. So now we're getting into the guts of the critique of pure reason, which is, so he begins on page 479 by lamenting the history of metaphysics and saying that it hasn't gained an inch. It seems peculiarly suited for those who desire to exercise themselves in mock combats. No participant has ever yet succeeded in gaining even so much as an inch of territory, not at least in such manner as to secure him in its permanent possession. This shows beyond all questioning that the procedure of metaphysics has hitherto been a merely random groping. Okay, what's the sure road to science for metaphysics, he's saying? The examples of mathematics and natural science, this is page 480 on the left-hand column. The examples of mathematics and natural science, which by a single and sudden revolution have become what they now are, seem to me sufficiently remarkable to suggest our considering what may have been the essential feature in the changed point of view by which they have so greatly benefited. So the changed point of view by which they've so greatly benefited is the Copernican idea. So I'll just skip down a little bit to the bottom of that left-hand column. This would agree better. All right, so we must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. So our knowledge does not conform to objects. the objects conform to our knowledge. But what are the objects? They're really appearances. What appears to us is what conforms to our knowledge. So let me just go over this again. So he's comparing the history of, or the science of metaphysics. What is real? What are the first principles of being? He's saying, so far, Plato, Aristotle, all these people, nobody's even gained 1 inch of sure success. They all contradict each other. Is there any hope? Yes, the natural sciences have shown us a way. These mathematical sciences, the examples of mathematics and natural science, he's saying, they're showing us a way. Their success should incline us, at least by way of experiment, to imitate their procedure. Hitherto, it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, but all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori, by means of concepts, have, on this assumption, ended in failure. So he's talking about Hume there, and I'll go over it again. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. So Hume said, there's no way you can have necessary universal truths about objects that you perceive empirically. That's just the way things have happened in the past, and you're assuming, oh, the pattern has always been that way in the past, therefore I'm habituated to see it that way, and therefore I assume it must necessarily continue in that same pattern, which Newton described with his mathematical theory of gravity and all of his physics that would predict the way nature behaves and worked. Hume is saying, yeah, it works, but doesn't mean it'll necessarily always work. It's not a universal truth. There's no such thing. So Kant is saying, yeah, if you assume that he says, but all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori means before experience, by means of concepts, have on this assumption ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. So the essential thing is the objects we perceive are really the way they appear to us. Those appearances must necessarily conform to the categories of our own understanding, that our minds are not a blank slate, a tabula rasa, like John Locke said, that we're born with a blank slate and then our sense impressions like chalk write up all our knowledge. That's not the way it is, says Kant. Our minds shape very distinctly every sense perception that comes in. Whatever the unknown thing in itself is, when we perceive it through our sense perceptions, our minds are like a computer with programming, and it transforms that chaotic flux into the single objects we see. I don't see, an infinite series of photons bound, and all the chaos around me. I see one thing. I see this mouse. I know that it's made of a bunch of atoms and it's a chaos of energy, but what do I actually perceive? This one thing. So Kant is saying, I can be sure of how this thing will behave. The laws of Newtonian gravity will always work necessarily, because they're not telling me anything about this object as it is in itself unperceived by me. Those laws of physics are only telling me how I will always perceive this thing in itself. Its appearance to me, I can be absolutely certain of before ever having to have a sensory experience of it, because all I have to do is consult the categories of my own understanding, which tell me the way any object I perceive will behave, because the objects I perceive are just the appearances of my own mind. I have categories of thought which can tell me how my thoughts work. That's not such a crazy thing to say, says Kant to Hume. He says, granted, I don't know how your mind could perceive an object that's an unthinking substance outside of your mind. How do ideas in your mind make contact with some unthinking substance? We saw George Berkeley point that out, and David Hume accepted what Berkeley said, but rejected his idea of a mind. Berkeley said there's only ideas in the minds that perceive them. What you call material objects are just sense perceptions, and sense perceptions are ideas in your mind. So you see a tree, that's a bunch of different sense perceptions that you formulate into the idea of a tree in your mind. But there are no physical things outside of a perceiving mind, says Berkeley. Hume agrees, but he says, but there's also no mind. So you can't perceive a self, you can't perceive a mind. So how does he account for the fact that he's thinking? It's a good question. It's a good question to the Buddhists as well, because the Buddhists and David Hume have the same argument, that all you ever experience is this ever-changing series of sense perceptions and memories. Well, where's the self? It's not empirically observable, and yet how is it that you are aware? And then, to me, that's a good question. David Hume and the Buddhists seem to say, hey, I'm not claiming to know everything. As a matter of fact, I'm claiming to know nothing other than the fact that there's nothing to be known. And they are claiming to know that definitively. So is that a self-contradicting argument or not? That's a whole nother philosophical question. So what Kant is saying is, all right, I'll grant you that. I can't empirically observe anything that's a thing, the idea of a single unified object and a single unified self are not empirically observable, but he's saying the fact that we do observe single objects proves that we are a self. Because we have a unified consciousness, and if we didn't, we would never be able to detect single objects in the flux of changing sense perceptions. It's not something that, according to David Hume, you can just have a propensity to make this fiction like willy-nilly. Oh, well, to make my life easier, I'll just, instead of seeing a flux, I'll observe a single object. Kant is saying that's an automatic process, and it's rooted in the fact that you are a self. And so now we're going to get into, I know I'm moving around because everything's interconnected. I'm going to get back to this whole Copernicus thing. All right, so we're going to get into the self with Kant and David Hume, but let me continue here on page 480 so we can get the Copernicus question out of the way. So he's already said, I can't know things as they are in themselves, but I can know them as they appear to me. Bottom of 480, left-hand column. This would agree better with what is desired, namely, that it should be possible to have knowledge of objects a priori, determining something in regard to them prior to their being given through sense experience. We should then be proceeding precisely on the lines of Copernicus's primary hypothesis. So there's the question. Why does Kant compare himself to Copernicus? Continuing here on 480 on the right-hand column. Failing of satisfactory progress in explaining the movements of the heavenly bodies on the supposition that they all revolved around the spectator, the earth, he tried whether he might not have better success if he made the spectator to revolve and the stars to remain at rest. A similar experiment can be tried in metaphysics as regards the intuition of objects. If intuition must conform to the constitution of the objects, I do not see how we could know anything of the latter a priori. And I'm going to go over this, but if the object, as object of the senses, must conform to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, I have no difficulty in conceiving such a possibility. All right, so Copernicus, what's all this crazy epicycles people are talking about? Here's the Earth, and the sun goes around, and Mercury and Venus, and sometimes they're going backwards, and what's the deal? That's too chaotic. Can we simplify it? Yeah. Let's take the sun out of the fourth orbit or whatever it was, put it in the center, and take Earth out of the center and put it as the third rock from the sun, and now everything is much easier. Yeah, what appears to us as the planets going backwards is a result of all of the planets revolving around the sun. So similarly, let's not think that we are understanding objects outside of us, because there's no way, Berkeley and Hume showed us, that your consciousness, which is made of ideas, can have contact with an unthinking substance that exists outside of a perceiving mind. Where's the connecting point? You can't have knowledge of these things because it's all you perceive through your knowledge comes from your senses, and that's all you can see. You don't see any necessary laws of nature. You don't even see the links of cause and effect. You see this happen, you see that happen. This repeatedly happens, and then you insert this idea of a necessary causal link. This happens as the cause, that happens as the effect. That's necessarily true everywhere in the universe. No, it isn't, says Berkeley and Hume. Kant is saying, yes, it is, but don't try to see that you're understanding these objects in themselves. Try to see it rather that what you're really understanding is simply the way the thing in itself, the objects, you can't even really call them objects, the unknowable whatever it is, manifest as single objects in your understanding. It appears to you that this, and me, to you and me, it appears that this is one single thing, not a chaos of sights. So don't try to understand that thing in itself. That's unknowable. You'll never know. Just limit yourself to trying to understand the appearances in your own mind. So you've just kind of flipped. You're not really understanding this thing outside you. Rather, you're understanding that thing outside you, what appears to be a thing outside you. You're not trying to understand the laws that it's following. You're trying to understand the fact that it's following the laws of your own understanding. That you're not observing this objective universe that is following its own laws, and you're trying to, as an outsider, trying to look in and see, well, what's going on. What you're seeing is the whole so-called objective universe is a creation of the categories of your own understanding. What are they? Well, there's two types, and there's the categories of reason. Let's see here. The laws of understanding and the laws of sensation. So the categories of sensation are space and time. You see things in the context of space and time. So this is the summer of 2019 class, so it's pretty warm in this room over here. So the space and time are not empirically observable. You can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear space or time. And all of your sensibilities, so if you look on page 477, the bottom paragraph there, this is the introductory notes. Kant denies that we can have knowledge of noumena. Noumena means things in themselves. Indeed, we never encounter things in themselves. Everything we perceive or conceive has been conditioned by our faculties of perception and thought. Sensibility, our faculty of perception, imposes the form of space and time on objects perceived. The understanding, the faculty of thought, imposes the categories which give our thoughts logical form. We can speak of objects or events causing other objects or events. We can speak of things existing or failing to exist. We thereby speak solely of appearances. The categories apply only to things as conditioned by sensibility and understanding. We cannot legitimately apply them to things in themselves, so we cannot even officially say that there are things in themselves. Okay, so the faculty of perception, what are the a priori categories of thought that condition our sense perceptions? The two main ones are space and time. Any sense perception you have is automatically filtered through this category of space and time. And they're not empirically observable. So if you're a strict empiricist, then like Hume and Berkeley realized, you don't really believe in physical objects, three-dimensional physical objects enduring in some space through time, because you can't identify space or time with your sense perceptions. So Kant is saying, okay, and yet nevertheless, there does seem to be this certain regular laws of physics that apply everywhere. So what's going on? How is that even possible? Hume was right. He woke me from my dogmatic slumber, Kant says, not in our selection. So how can Newton's laws of physics actually give us predictive a priori knowledge of the material nature? And yet how can Hume be correct, as his empiricist philosophy shows? How is it that we can know for certain the way things are going to behave? It seems to be impossible, because our minds, how are they going to touch someone thinking substance outside of our minds? This is what Berkeley and Hume were trying to say. That's impossible. So Kant was saying, yes, you're right, it is impossible. But it's not impossible for us to understand the laws of the appearances in our own minds. So the laws of physics are really for Kant the laws of psychology. And what he's trying to analyze are these categories of thought. And that is what's different again. You go over this with Plato. Plato said the ideas through which we perceive things create the things we perceive. Kant is saying, no, we can't say that. All we can say is the categories of thought, these a priori, before sense perceptions, these categories of thought that are there before any sense perceptions and automatically organize those sense perceptions for our human understanding. We can know what they are, and they can tell us exactly how appearances will behave in the future, always for us, everywhere. But they don't tell us anything about the thing in itself. That's the fundamental difference between Kant's rationalism and Plato's rationalism. And I'll go over it at least one more time. The Copernican Revolution in philosophy, Kant's philosophy, is he's saying we're not trying to analyze the outside physical world. We're trying to analyze the way the unknowable thing in itself is categorized by our own process of understanding. So you're not here looking at the world, you're looking in. You're turning your eye of the mind inward and trying to understand the way the mind works, realizing that you can never have knowledge of the so-called material objective world, only of your appearances. And so the other question was, how does Kant's and Hume's theory of the self, how are they similar and different? So let me just read that exactly. In what ways are Kant's theory of the self similar to and different than Hume's theory of self in chapter 10 of our book? All right, so I think I've gone enough of a generalization, so now let me try to get a little more specific. So if you go back to chapter 10, David Hume, a treatise on human nature, and I want to be able to get back here easily enough. So as an empiricist, he says, I don't perceive a self. I believe knowledge comes from sense impressions, and therefore on page 284 he says, from what impression could this idea be derived? If any impression gives rise to the idea of a self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist in the same time. It cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of a self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. So that is his basic argument. I don't perceive a self is supposed to be the same from one moment to the next. It endures through time. For Plato, the self is an eternal soul, an unchanging eternal soul, just like the absolute ideas that it perceives imprinted on itself. Hume says, I don't perceive any unchanging sense impression, and since that's all that reality is, there must be no self. What deludes you into thinking that you perceive a self is the inconceivable rapidity of this flux of different sense perceptions, he says on page 285. So he says we might have on page 286, we have a certain propension to create these fictions. He says, but we may farther observe that we do not give rise to such a fiction. But we may further observe that where we do not give rise to such a fiction of a self, our propension to confound identity with relation is so great that we are apt to imagine something unknown and mysterious connecting the parts besides their relation. So the same arguments that Hume uses against the idea of an individual enduring self, he applies to the idea of physical objects, unified physical objects. There's no such thing as a mouse, or as Nagasena said, there's no such thing as a self to King Melinda, just like there's no such thing as a chariot. It's just a word that refers to this temporary assembly of ever-changing parts. So that's what Hume is saying also. There's just the inconceivable rapidity of this flux of sense perceptions that deludes us into thinking they're one continuous self, like a movie reel. You have all these still frames rapidly going past the projector light. It gives the illusion of a continuous, ongoing motion picture. And also he says we insert this idea of cause and effect. We see this happen, and then that happen regularly, and we assume there's some necessary law of cause and effect. And one moment of our lives leads to the next, to the next. So our whole lives are connected by a chain of causes and effects. That's what we think. Hume says, I don't see any causal link. I can't touch it or smell it or hear it or taste it either. Therefore, it doesn't exist. There is no self. On page 289, he says, as a memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions, 'tis to be considered upon that account chiefly as the source of personal identity. Had we no memory, we never should have had any notion of causation, nor consequently of that chain of causes and effects which constitute our self or person. So you have a memory of all the, not all the things, but you have a memory of a lot of the things that you've done. And so you are assuming there's this causal link connecting them all. If you don't believe in the reality of causality, and that's the source of self, then there is no self. So there's David Hume's theory of a self. Now, going to Kant, he'll admit, yes, I do not perceive a self with any of my 5 sense organs, nor do I perceive individual objects continuing in an unchanged way. All I perceive is sense perceptions. I'll grant you that. But it appears to me that these things are enduring physical objects. And it appears to me, and why is that? Why, instead of a flux of sense perceptions, do I perceive one unified object like this mouse? Because he's going to say, you are a self. That's the fundamental principle. So there's his metaphysics. And this is where he gets into his concept of transcendental apperception. Okay, so if you're going to answer the question about comparing Hume and Kant's theory of a self, this is the page you want to go to, page 482, on the right-hand column, about the middle of the way down. So he says, this original and transcendental condition is no other than transcendental apperception. All right, so what does that mean? Consciousness of self, according to the determinations of our state in inner perception, is merely empirical and always changing. No fixed and abiding self can present itself in this flux of inner appearances. So that's what Hume was saying. Such consciousness is usually named inner sense or empirical apperception. What has necessarily to be represented as numerically identical cannot be thought as such through empirical data. And I'm going to go over this a few times. So to render such a transcendental presupposition valid, there must be a condition which precedes all experience and makes experience itself possible. So when he uses the word experience, he's talking about sense perception, sense experience. That's the word they're using. So to render such a transcendental presupposition valid, there must be a condition which precedes all experience and makes experience itself possible. How is it that I experience a single object and not a crazy flux of sense perceptions? The fact that that's even possible for me to do, to transform a crazy flux into a single enduring object, demands that I have a unifying faculty in my understanding, something that changes flux into individual objects. That's the self. Because you have a unified self of consciousness, that conditions all of these many sense perceptions coming in and forms them into single objects, all of which must follow very definite laws. We call them the laws of physics, but really they're the laws of the categories of understanding. That's what Kant is trying to say. And that's kind of this Copernican revolution. Newton's thought he was understanding the outside laws of nature, and what Kant is saying is no, what he's discovered is the laws of the categories of our own understanding. And all of those categories of understanding, space and time, the categories of sensibility, which form our sense perceptions and frame them into this framework of space and time, those are mental constructs. well, they're not mental constructs. Space and time, we don't construct them. They're the organizing principles of our mind. They're the way our mind organizes incoming sense perceptions. So that and the idea of causality, those are the three big ones. Those are built in and they're rooted in the ultimate self, which we can understand through transcendental apperception. And now I know this is extremely difficult, but I'm getting into the details now. So, continuing, it'll make a little more sense as we go through. There can be in us no modes of knowledge, no connection or unity of one mode of knowledge with another, without the unity of consciousness that precedes all data of intuitions. So for him, intuitions is the objects that you perceive. What am I seeing? A pen. It's an intuition. It's not the thing in itself. It's just what I'm perceiving. I already had one in my hand anyway. So you got to understand the way he uses words in a unique way. And in this introductory class, it's not expected that you would get into this. You would normally, this is introducing you to a bunch of philosophers. If by any chance you are attracted to one philosopher or another, you can take another philosophy class just on Immanuel Kant, and then you would really get into this and write a paper on this and analyze maybe one paragraph. I'm just introducing you to the way that these guys think, and so that's going to be relatively brief, and even so, it's already been 41 minutes. All right, so continuing here, he says, so I'll read that again and then read the next sentence. There can be in us no modes of knowledge and no connection or unity of one mode of knowledge with another without the unity of consciousness that precedes all data of intuitions. Before any sense perceptions come in, you have a unity of consciousness, a self. By relation to it, representation of objects is alone possible. This pure, original, unchangeable consciousness I name transcendental apperception. That it deserves this name is clear from the fact that even the purest objective unity, namely that of the a priori concepts, space and time, is only possible through relation of the intuitions to such unity of consciousness. I'm going to go a little further and then go back. The numerical unity of this apperception is thus the a priori ground of all concepts, just as the manifoldness of space and time is the a priori ground of the intuitions of sensibility. Okay, and I'm going to continue after that, but let me now go back and analyze this paragraph a little bit more. So he's saying, there can be in us no modes of knowledge, no connection or unity of one mode of knowledge with another, without the unity of consciousness that precedes all data of intuitions. The unity of consciousness. You don't experience what David Hume and the Buddhists say you really are, which is this flux of ever-changing sense perceptions. Perception is sense perceptions. Apperception is looking inward. You have things going on in your own mind as well. Emotions and memories, things that aren't coming from within. But there's empirical apperception, which is just, okay, let me just sit here and think. What are my memories? What am I experiencing? Emotions coming up. Okay, a sense, a sound, a sight. That's what Hume was talking about. That's what the Buddhists were talking about. That's empirical apperception. And Kant agrees, yeah, there's no self that you can ever learn about through that process. Transcendental apperception is transcending or going beyond sense perceptions. Can you know something beyond sense perceptions? Empiricists say absolutely not. That's our whole thing. We say knowledge comes through sense perceptions. What Kant is going to say is that's an absurd belief, because you would never experience those sense perceptions the way you do were there not some pre-existing structuring principles of your own consciousness. That we're not experiencing this flux that they say is all you can actually experience. We do. Why is it everyone agrees? Yeah, this is a single thing. That's what common sense tells you it is. If you analyze it carefully in your mind, you'll say, well, actually, I'm not, I don't empirically observe space or time. So how could this thing, which appears to be a three-dimensional spherical column, exist in space and time? My whole sense perceptions are fictitious. The human being has a propensity to create these fictions. Kant says we don't choose to create them. That's the pre-given structures of our own thought, and they're stable, and they're real things. Just because they're not empirically observable doesn't mean they're not real. So Kant isn't an empiricist. He is a rationalist, but then again, the difference between his forms of reason and Plato's are that his forms of reason apply only to human understanding. At least that's all we can say for sure. We can't say that what I perceive actually is giving me knowledge of what's out there. There's a complete divide between things in themselves existing before they're perceived by humans and the world of our perceptions. All we can ever know is the world of our perceptions. But that world we can know about with absolute certainty, that things that we can know what necessarily will always happen everywhere in the universe. Wherever a human being goes in the universe, the same laws will apply, says Kant. And that fact is rooted in the unity of our own self. Granted, we can't perceive that self through sense perceptions, but we can logically infer that it must exist because of the ordered nature of the world that we do perceive. What we call nature is the world of appearances, and it does follow very predictable, regular patterns. How can that be possible? Because we're only observing the appearances of our own mind. And those sense perceptions have been categorized in definite a law-governed way, and the source of those laws of our perception is the self. This is like Plato's idea of the good. All of the other ideas, the idea of justice and beauty, and then the other ideas that describe the physical workings of the material world, the mathematical laws that describe the orbits of the planets, they all come from the idea of the good. Similarly, all of the categories of thought, space and time, as well as the idea of cause and effect, they come from this idea of the self. And we learn about the idea of the self through transcendental apperception, which is simply logically analyzing the law-governed way objects appear to us. So I'll continue to read now. The bottom of page 482, he says, the numerical unity of this apperception is thus the a priori ground of all concepts, just as the manifold of space and time is the a priori ground of the intuitions of sensibility. The Buddhists and Hume do not believe in any single enduring unit of anything. There is no chariot, there is no self. Kant is saying, yes, there is a unit, it is the self, and it unifies all of our different sense perceptions into individual objects that obey one set of physical laws. So the unifying agent behind all of our perceptions is the self. All right, so continuing on page 483 on the left-hand column, he says, this transcendental unity of apperception forms, out of all the possible appearances that can stand alongside one another in one experience, a connection of all these representations according to laws. For this unity of consciousness would be impossible if the mind, in knowledge of the manifold, could not become conscious of the identity of function, whereby it synthetically combines it into one knowledge. All right, you see what I've been dealing with? I've been reading this and reading this. That's why I'm putting this out so late. And it goes on in that vein, but if you read through it, it starts to make more sense. He goes on to say, the original and necessary consciousness of the identity of the self is thus, at the same time, a consciousness of an equally necessary unity of the synthesis of all appearances according to concepts, that is, according to rules. This not only makes them necessarily reproducible, but also in so doing determines an object for their intuition, that is, the concept of something in which they are necessarily interconnected. I'm going to continue and then go back. For the mind could never think its identity in the manifoldness of its representations, and indeed think this identity a priori, if it did not have before its eyes the identity of its acts, whereby it subordinates all synthesis of apprehension, which is empirical, to a transcendental unity, thereby rendering possible their interconnection according to a priori rules. All right, so I'll break this up a little bit, but let me read the last part there. He says, for the mind could never think its identity in the manifoldness of its representations. So the mind could never even develop the fiction of its unity, of its enduring selfhood. It couldn't have done that just by observing things. It wouldn't just happen automatically. Hume says, oh yeah, well, a lot of sense perceptions happen and we have memories, and then the human being just has a propensity to make up these fictions of a self. Kant is saying, no, nobody would just arbitrarily stumble upon the, I'm a self, I'm an individual self. He says that would never happen, and here's how he's trying to explain it. So, for the mind could never think its identity in the manifoldness of its representations, and indeed think this identity a priori, if it did not have before its eyes the identity of its act, whereby it subordinates all. All right, so what's the identity of its act? The fact that it perceives identical unified objects enduring through time. That is the function of the self. It transforms the flux of sense perceptions into single unified things that endure through space and time. That isn't something that would just randomly happen. The fact it's something that happens a priori. Before we ever have sense experiences, our minds have structures ready to go to digest these sense impressions and turn them into objects of knowledge that follow the laws of nature. And it's the very fact that we perceive a world that's ordered by laws of nature that proves we must be a self, forcing the world into those patterns of perception. So again, he says, for the mind could never think its identity in the manifoldness of its representations, the flux of representations, and indeed think this identity a priori. So before you even have sense perceptions, you've got a self. I mean, so, this is complicated to me too. I'm no Kant expert, although I've read a lot of Kant, and at any rate, I know I'm probably going deeper than you need me to go, and I've already given you, I think, a sufficient amount for answering the questions. I'm just trying to introduce enough to okay, I see how Kant's paragraphs finally made sense after a little while. So that's what I'm trying to do. All right, so for the mind could never think its identity in the manifoldness of its representations, and indeed think this identity a priori, if it did not have before its eyes the identity of its act. The identity of its act is nature, whereby it subordinates all synthesis of apprehension, which is empirical, to a transcendental unity, thereby rendering possible their interconnection according to a priori rules. All right, so the fact that we subordinate the flux of sense perceptions, this is how I'm understanding what he's saying, is what enables us to know that we are a self. That we need to see the ordered nature of the universe, not to realize that we're just this insignificant bug floating in a soulless void. Rather, when you look at and think that you're perceiving material objects acting according to laws of physics, what you're really doing is discovering all of the different categories of thought and the way they interact with each other, all of which, taken together, constitute the self. So, I'll continue to read here. 483 on the left-hand column. Now, also, we are in a position to determine more adequately our concept of an object in general. So again, he'll say, our concept of an object is created for us by the categories of thought, space and time. Give us the sensible understanding of our sense perception. So all representations have as representations their object, and can themselves in turn become objects of other representations. Appearances are the sole objects which can be given to us immediately. I see the appearance of a pen. That's what I am understanding. It's what my mind is contacting directly. What is this thing outside of my perceptions of it? What is it in itself? There's no way for me to ever know that. So appearances are the sole objects which can be given to us immediately, and that in them which relates immediately to the object is called intuition. My image of this pen is the intuition in my mind. That's the idea of the pen in my mind. But these appearances are not things in themselves. They are only representations, which in turn have their object. An object which cannot itself be intuited by us, and which may therefore be named the non-empirical, that is, transcendental object equals X. X equals the unknown in algebra. It's 1 times X equals 7. And through the laws of math, you can determine X equals 7. But he's saying there's no way we can ever know what this thing in itself is a transcendental object. It's outside our ability to perceive with our sense perceptions. Our sense perceptions are just ideas in our mind, and we can understand the laws that govern them. But what the thing is outside of it, we cannot know. I know I've said that a bunch of times, but that's the main thing with Kant. So continuing here, he says, the pure concept of this transcendental object, which in reality through all our knowledge is always one and the same, is what can alone confer upon all our empirical concepts and general relation to an object, that is, objective reality. So this pure concept of this transcendental object, all right, I'm going to continue. This concept cannot contain any determinate intuition and therefore refers only to the unity which must be found in any manifold of knowledge that stands in relation to an object. This relation is nothing but the necessary unity of consciousness, and therefore also of the synthesis of the manifold through a common function of the mind that combines it in one representation. This unity must be regarded as necessary a priori, otherwise knowledge would be without an object. So the relation to a transcendental object, that is, the objective reality of our empirical knowledge, rests on the transcendental law that all appearances, insofar as through them objects are to be given to us, must stand under a priori rules, those of synthetic unity, whereby the interrelating of these appearances in empirical intuition is alone possible. In other words, and I'm glad he's giving some other words, appearances in experience must stand under the conditions of the necessary unity of apperception. Just as in mere intuition, they must be subject to the formal conditions of space and time. Only thus can any knowledge become possible at all. So let me just read that last sentence, and that's the only one I'm going to analyze. In other words, appearances in experience must stand under the conditions of the necessary unity of apperception. The unity of apperception, again, apperception is perceiving things in your own mind. There's empirical apperception and there's transcendental apperception. Empirical apperception is what Hume and the Buddhists tell us to do. Look in, what do you experience? Thoughts, sights, sounds, emotions, they come and go. Oh yeah, no self, fine. Transcendental apperception is using logic to say, why is it, however, that this flux of sense perceptions is following such a well-ordered system? And Kant is saying, all of the ordered systematic way the appearances of the unknowable thing in itself follow are rooted in the self, this unifying agent, which is the source of all order in the universe that appears to our minds. And that's the only universe we can know, the universe of appearances. So without that unifying self in the core of our consciousness, it would be impossible to experience any objects at all. We wouldn't experience anything. There'd be no self, first of all, to experience anything, and the experiences would just be this random flux of sense perceptions. So there must be a self that forces those sense perceptions into very predictable patterns that always necessarily follow very predictable rules. The lawgiver of nature is the self. The self is gained through analyzing the way appearances appear to our minds. And I could read more to explain this a little bit. I think I'll read a little bit more here. All right, on page 484, the left-hand column, on my principles, it is easy to explain. All possible appearances as representations belong to the totality of a possible self-consciousness. So all possible appearances belong to the totality of a possible self-consciousness. Anything you could possibly observe in the universe belong to the totality of a possible self-consciousness. Again, the laws of physics for Kant are really the laws of psychology. So anything you could possibly learn about the so-called material universe is revealing more and more about the self, which is the unifying, organizing, law-giving agent of the world of appearances. So continuing, but as self-consciousness is a transcendental representation, numerical identity is inseparable from it and is a priori certain. For nothing can come to our knowledge save in terms of this original apperception. Our consciousness is filtered through categories of thought, space and time, and then the idea of cause and effect. We'll just leave it to those simple three. Those, furthermore, go through one last filter, which is the idea of a self, and that's what unifies all of the sense perceptions into one worldview. We perceive a unified vision of nature, and we have a unified sense of myself. It is not empirically observable, and yet we all feel that way. Why do we feel that way? Because we are a self. It's just not empirically observable. So, continuing here, he says, but as self-consciousness is a transcendental representation, numerical identity is inseparable from it and is a priori certain, for nothing can come to our knowledge save in terms of this original apperception. Our knowledge is filtered through the unifying self. This identity must necessarily enter into the synthesis of all the manifold of appearances, so far as the synthesis is to yield empirical knowledge. So the appearances are subject to a priori conditions. The synthesis of their apprehension must be in complete accordance with them. The representations of a universal condition according to which a certain manifold can be posited in uniform fashion is called a rule, and when it must be so posited, a law. So I'm going to skip a little bit. That nature should direct itself according to our subjective ground of apperception, and should indeed depend upon it in respect of its conformity to law, sounds very strange and absurd. So he says that nature should direct itself according to our subjective ground of apperception, so that the nature isn't obeying the laws of our psychology. Nature in itself is not doing that. What is obeying the laws of our thought categorizations is the appearances of nature. So it would be absurd to say nature's following our psychological categories of thought. So then he'll go on to say, but when we consider that this nature is not a thing in itself, but is merely an aggregate of appearances, so many representations of the mind, we shall not be surprised that we can discover it only in the radical faculty of all our knowledge, namely in transcendental apperception. In that unity alone, it can be entitled the object of all possible experience, that is, nature. Nor shall we be surprised that just for this very reason, this unity can be known a priori, and therefore as necessary, all right, so I'm going to leave it at that, and then I'm going to go back over and read these questions one more time. The fact that the world of appearances follows these, first of all, appears as objects that are interrelated with each other according to strict laws. That whole ordered nature of objects is because our sense perceptions are all being categorized through these a priori categories of thought. And it's like space and time are the outermost lenses, the idea of cause and effect, still deeper than that, and then ultimately the idea of transcendental apperception, which is the self. Everything that we experience is filtered through those organizing lenses, and they create the laws of nature we perceive. It is itself the lawgiver of nature, he'll conclude on page 485. Okay, so there's a lot more detail in there that I've made notes about, but I'm not going to get into it because we've already been an hour and 4 minutes. So let me just go back over these questions and then we'll finish it off. So for exam 3, part A, question 3. In what ways are Kant's theory of a self similar to and different than Hume's theory of a self in chapter 10 of our book? So again, Hume is an empiricist. I don't perceive a self through any of my 5 sense organs, a self must be the same from one moment to the next. There are no sense perceptions that are the same from one moment to the next. Therefore, the self is a fiction. The human being has a propensity to these kinds of fictions. And he also attacks the idea of cause and effect. Just because these memories I have follow a timeline, and we assume that each moment causes the next moment to occur, therefore, all of these memories are connected by a chain of causes and effect. Hume says, I don't see any cause and effect. That's an idea of the human mind, an idea of relationships between empirically observable things. It's not real. So there's no enduring sense perception that applies to a self. And even though the idea of a bunch of separate moments connected by the chain of cause and effects, that's also invalid. There is no self. Kant says, yes, that's true. There is no empirical apperception of a self. You can't look inward to your memories and emotions and sense perceptions and find a self. But transcendental apperception will enable you to logically determine that you must be a self because it's the source of all of the forms that you perceive. You don't perceive a flux of sense perceptions. You perceive distinct individual objects that obey very definite, necessary, universal laws of nature. How is that possible? There must be a reason for it. The self is the reason. It's the unifying synthesizer of sense perceptions that forces the appearances in your mind to follow very strict rules. Okay, so part B, question number 5. Why does Kant compare himself to Copernicus? Copernicus took our thought away from everything's revolving around the Earth, and he put the sun in the center of the solar system and had the Earth revolve around the sun. So he just inverted the point of view. And Kant similarly says, you think that you're trying to understand objects outside yourself. Berkeley and Hume showed you that that's impossible. You can't have certain absolute necessary universal truths about objects outside of you, because how are the ideas in your mind going to contact some unthinking substance outside your mind? Those are 2 different species of being. Where's the connecting point? We saw that with René Descartes. Princess Elizabeth said, how can mind, which is thinking substance unextended in space, contact unthinking substance that is extended in space? In other words, matter. Where's the connecting point? I don't see it. Similarly, for Kant, he's saying for Hume and Berkeley, there's no connecting point between the ideas in our minds and some outward material objects. So we cannot have any ordered knowledge of the universe, says David Hume, ultimately. We can just know the way things have happened in the past, assume they're going to probably happen that way in the future, but at best we can have probable knowledge. Kant is saying, no, you're not trying to put your understanding and wrap it around objects outside yourself. Rather, turn that inside out, and what you're really trying to understand is the appearances in your own mind. Forget about knowledge of the outward objects. You can't have. It's impossible. To know it is to transform it through the categories of thought. So the unknowable thing in itself is one thing. A study of nature is not a study of the outward world. It's turn that inside out. It's the study of your own psychological categories of thought. And you can look on page 480 for more details if that's the question that you want to answer. So part B, question 6. What is the difference between Kant's rationalism and Plato's rationalism? Again, for Plato, the forms of reason, the absolute ideas, are the sources of the physical objects that we perceive. Plato will say, yeah, those physical objects are always changing. They're never the same from one moment to the next, so you can't have knowledge of them. How can you have knowledge of something that won't even be there the next moment? You can have an opinion about the way it'll probably appear to you, but those objects are really like dreams or shadows projected from the eternal forms, the absolute ideas. Those are the objects that reason perceives. They're imprinted on your soul. or the cause of the material world. There is no unknowable thing in itself for Plato. You can know everything by knowing the idea of the good. The idea of the good is the source of everything. It's the source of the way you perceive things, and it's the source of the things that you perceive. For Kant, no. The idea of the good he calls transcendental apperception, which is the self, and it unifies all of our perceptions, all of the appearances of nature to us. That's what the self organizes for us, but it isn't the source of the objects themselves, of the thing in itself. So that's the big difference. Okay, that was a lot, and in the next videos I'm going to be going over Hegel and Nietzsche.